Hi, everybody. I'm Stephanie Swallow. I'm a professor of practice here. Some of you are my students, so you know me already. But I want to first welcome you and say how excited I am to see so many of you here at this wonderful event. Thank you for coming to our New Voices in Creative Nonfiction reading, where you'll get to hear one of your amazing fellow students whose work was chosen by our visiting writer, Hasanthika Sirisena. Hasanthika Sirisena's essays have appeared in Michigan Quarterly Review, Copper Nickel, Kenyon Review Online, WSQ, anthologized in This Is the Place, and named a notable essay by Best American Essays in 2022. They are the author of the short story collection, The Other One, from University of Massachusetts Press, and their essay collection, Dark Tourist, won the Gournay Prize and was shortlisted for a Lambda Literary Award. Sirisena's essays, from what I've seen of them so far, they're absolutely beautiful. I'm halfway through the collection now, and they cast a wide net, bringing historical research, like the crash of a nuclear warhead-loaded B-52 bomber, the Sri Lankan Civil War, Oscar Wilde, Lady Windermere's syndrome, Shakespeare, the Beatles, all to bear on personal stories of grief, disability, queerness, and identity. And in that way, I can see an affinity between your work. Kierkegaard said of Dark Tourist, the book shimmers with honesty, vulnerability, and circumspection, and I quite agree. Please join me in welcoming Hasanthika Sirisena.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was fantastic. Thank you, and Kiana, that was wonderful. I'm thrilled to be able to read with you, and I do think our work is in discussion with each other, so that's fantastic. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I'd like it if we could do a little bit of question and answer at the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read from sections from, I think, 3 different essays, to sort of give you a sense of some of the things that I'm considering or thinking about when I'm writing essays. And I only started writing essays maybe about 5 years ago, maybe longer than 6 years ago. And maybe one of the questions I want to ask is, why did I switch from fiction to doing essays? But I've just fallen deeply in love with the sort of what the essay can offer you as a writer. And I'm going to start with Broken Arrow, which is the first essay in the collection. The form of the essay is called a braided essay, and what it does is it braids 2 really different incidents. One is the near nuclear detonation of a bomb over Goldsboro, North Carolina, and if you don't know about this, it's actually quite famous. And then the other is my father's immigration, or my family's immigration to North Carolina. And I'm just going to read the first part of this. Broken Arrow, 1961. On January 22nd, along the coast of North Carolina, the 8-man crew of a B-52 realizes their plane is losing fuel too fast. The right wing might be damaged, but there's no way for them to check. Only 2 members of the crew can see outside, and all that is visible to either of them is the night sky and the ocean, a purple-red bruise intersecting at the horizon. The pilot, Major Tulloch, radios Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in Goldsboro, North Carolina, that the plane must make an emergency landing. This wouldn't be particularly notable, except that the Keep 19 mission is part of the Strategic Air Command, is on a test run for a program meant to allow the United States to be the first to attack in case of a nuclear war. The plane carries 2 Mark 39 thermonuclear weapons, in other words, 2 hydrogen bombs. Both of these bombs together have an explosive yield 500 times greater than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, and a kill range of somewhere between 7 and 8.5 miles. Each is active, ready to detonate upon being dropped. And this is not in the essay, but I do want to take a moment to think about that for a moment. The United States was flying these bombs over this country, right? The January night is cold, and because of a front moving through the air at the altitude is The air at that altitude is estimated at 150 knots. A Category 1 hurricane measures winds of 62 to 82 knots. During the second mid-air refueling, the turbulence is so strong, Tulloch struggles to keep the plane steady. He feels every buffet and pitch in his muscles, in his bones. The cockpit of the bomber is not a comfortable place. It is all metal and glass and smells of sweat, burnt rubber, and urine. The crew has been on alert not just for the 10-hour flying time, but also before that on the ground as they waited for hours to receive their commands. They are, by now, simultaneously tired and wired, fueled by adrenaline and raw desire to complete the mission. At some point during the refueling, the pilot reportedly asks the co-pilot to hand-fly the plane so he can rest a moment. It takes at least 3 tries to finish what should be a simple process. Flying a plane takes strength, coordination, and mental stamina under any circumstances. B-52 Stratofortresses are massive planes, 200 tons of metal, a wingspan of over 180 feet, 8 engines. In the sky, these are the hulking monsters of war movies, casting long shadows that slide menacingly across the fields and mountains. On the runway, the bulk slows the bomber down and causes it to waddle as it accelerates. Ground crews dub the lumbering procession the Elephant Walk. The standard instrument panel consists of 8 throttles and 32 gauges for monitoring the engines. But I'm not being fair when I reconstruct this plane using only bolts and metal planes, tonnage and turbo power. The B-52 is surprisingly sensitive, with a delicately balanced central nervous system dedicated ultimately to maintaining life. I'm always shocked when I read about plane crashes, as I like to do, to realize that planes aren't built to beat nature. Nothing man-made can at an altitude of 40,000 feet, but to defy it, like an extended and especially precarious game of tiddlywinks. Major Tulloch is a career soldier with the thick, beefy features of an extra in a World War II reenactment. He enlisted after Pearl Harbor at the age of 29 and has served ever since, first as a soldier and later as a fighter pilot and a test pilot. He has hundreds of hours of combat experience and has walked away from 3 test plane crashes. He is, by military standards, an old man at 46, and at least a decade and a half older than most of the crew. But he is the sort of man SAC wants flying these missions, seasoned, tough, capable. He is not afraid when the crew reports that they have lost 19 tons of fuel in little under 2 minutes. He does not imagine, as I do, some dumb dinosaur-like beast suspended high above, beyond our ken, bleeding out, slowly dying. He does not feel that frisson of excitement, that metallic taste in the tongue at the thought of some great catastrophe. He is too professional to indulge imagination. He listens instead as the Atlas 57, the fuel tanker, informs him they have spotted the leak at the base of the right wing. He knows he and his crew are in some danger, though he does not know how much. He also understands that with that much fuel, with that much weight, they cannot land or the plane will break apart. They must stay aloft. He does as he is commanded. He moves the plane several hundred miles off the coast of Wilmington to prevent, if they do have to crash land, possible nuclear destruction. And then I fast forward to the second thread, second braid, 1975. A few months into his first job in America at Cherry Hospital in Goldsboro, my father is assigned a new patient, a paranoid schizophrenic who everyone else in the unit is afraid of. And that braid continues, and then I go back to the first one with the broken arrow incident over Goldsboro. But I'm not going to read that whole essay. I'm going to move to another essay in the collection. And one of the things I really love about essays is that they have a lot of, I think that many of you are creative writing practitioners or majors or minors, and one of the things I love about the essay is that in its current sort of form, it's absorbing other forms around it. There's another type of essay that's been really on my mind lately. It's called the hermit crab essay, and the hermit crab essay is not about hermit crabs. Anyone want to guess what a hermit crab essay might be? What do hermit crabs do? Yeah, go ahead. I can't see you with my reading glasses on, sorry. They do, but where do they get their shells from? Yeah. They steal shells. That's great, good. They steal shells from other shell-bearing animals, and so what a hermit crab essay does is it steals the shell, so it steals another form, and uses it as its own. So this one is actually called Amblyopia: A Medical History, and it's supposed to be a medical history of something that happened to me, the accident that caused the injury to my eye, to my left eye. But what was really fascinating about it, what I loved, is that I was also able to bring in a poet that I've long admired. If I don't really like him because he's not a really nice person or easy person to like, but I greatly, greatly admire him. And he lost his eyesight. And what we have some of his medical histories, because he too tried to use the medical history to understand what was happening to him. So Amblyopia: A Medical History. Force is equal to change in momentum per change in time, Part 1. That morning, I threw my school books in the back seat of my car, a common practice for me at the time, probably a common practice for most 16-year-olds. The intersection from my neighborhood to the main road was typically busy, morning rush hour, and I, relatively new to driving, probably a bit reckless, decided to take a chance and make the left turn, even though the oncoming white van was traveling fast. I hit the gas and the car lurched forward. Do I remember the car stalling? The force of the impact turned my textbooks into projectiles. One hit me in the back of the head, hard enough to knock me unconscious. My sister, who was in the passenger seat, wasn't hurt, but when she looked over at me and saw me unconscious, she thought I was dead. My mother told me later that the phone call from a neighbor to let her know there'd been an accident and the quiet on the other end when she asked if my sister and I were all right were the worst moments of her life. In the PICU, the neurologist informed my parents I had possibly suffered a severe brain injury. My left pupil was permanently dilated, indicating potential brain damage. They gave my parents the choice: operate or wait to see if I woke up. But the surgery itself was dangerous, life-threatening, and my parents decided to wait. They took turns sitting by my bedside, speaking to me in English and Sinhala. I have one memory from this time. I am semi-conscious, trapped between sleep and wakefulness. My father is speaking to me. If you don't wake up, you might die. I try to open my eyes, but it's as if a heavy gray towel has been placed over my face. That's the color, a kind of thick, liquid gray. I want to open my eyes because my father is begging, but I can't. I remained in a coma for 3 days. When I regained consciousness, my left eyelid was shut, and I couldn't open it. I try to use my lazy eye for personal advancement. The essay is divided into little subtitle sections. So. The editor wanted fiction and essays about disability. We were thrown together by a writer's conference, and I had 10 minutes to impress her. She sat next to me on a porch swing. I tried hard not to move because every time either one of us did, the swing pitched and threw us both off balance. I mentioned that I could write something on my lazy eye. She smiled kindly and shook her head. A lazy eye is not a disability. I tried to explain the double vision, the weakening eyesight. The editor sported a suit jacket, her hair cut in a neat bob. She leaned toward me to make it clear she was not unsympathetic. If not for the swing, she would have reached over and patted me on the knee. I'm looking for work by people who really have to struggle. I mean, who have really persevered against some terrible odds. She spoke softly and gently, the tone of a counselor. And your lazy eye, I wouldn't really have noticed it if you hadn't mentioned it. I switched to describing a short story I was working on about a young boy suffering from schizophrenia. John Milton Receives No Answers, Part 1. Ancient Arabic medicine provides 2 diagnoses for blindness, gutta serena and gutta obscura. Gutta obscura would now be more commonly known as cataract. The medical equivalent today of gutta serena is amaurosis, vision loss that results without any lesion or trauma to the eye itself, and therefore the pupil remains clear. In Paradise Lost, Milton describes his blindness this way: "But thou revisit not these eyes that roll in vain to find the piercing ray and find no dawn." All the extant accounts we have about Milton's blindness indicate that he went blind relatively young, around 45, and that he never truly knew why he was given no explanation by two separate diagnoses. The first, Sirisena, the other, Suffucio nigra, another term at the time for amaurosis. Both indicate that there was no apparent change in the structure of the eye itself, a cataract or glaucoma, to explain Milton's vision loss. This had been also confirmed in written accounts from a few of Milton's friends. And this goes on with me going back and forth between these sort of sections on it turns out I don't have a lazy eye. I actually have a serious injury to my eye. But even the ways in which people have sort of used the lazy eye as a way of maybe in some ways trying to understand but also dismiss what happened to me. And I'm going to skip to the very end of the essay. And I talk about, it turns out, if you may, those of you who study, there might be some people who study John Milton here, but he's kind of an asshole. And one of the things he does is, and the reason that I say that is that one of the things that he does is that he teaches his daughter to read Latin and Greek so that they can read to him, so that he could dictate to them large portions of Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, which are his great works. But he doesn't really teach them anything else. He doesn't give them much of an education beyond that. So he only taught them enough so that they could help him. Because of that, though, there are a lot of images in Western art of Milton and his daughters, and they tend to have his daughters sort of looking up to him as this great man and him and his genius, right? And this is the end of the essay. We like to imagine the blind Milton as a man at peace with his loss, made dignified by his pain, capable of writing the also serve who only stand and wait. We read through his careful rendering of his medical history and marvel at his pragmatic descriptions of what must have been a terrible trauma. But it is also an equally well-documented Milton as a man gripped by a deep and untenable fury. The swing between these two personas is so severe that it forms the basis of the conjecture that he suffered from congenital syphilis. What I never found was an explanation that attributed his cruelty to his attempts to live with his profound loss. I'm drawn to the rage, even though I'm aware that any attempt to ascribe it to an inability to accept his blindness is, at best, an educated guess. I'm drawn to it because I see much of myself in it, all the furiousness, the desire to crush others. The truth is, I have always despised the attempts to console me. In these moments, I feel a bitterness so acute it is, for a second, like a screen passing over my vision. I taste bitterness, like blood, at the back of my throat. No one has ever made me feel better. A few have made me feel worse. The only two people who have ever truly reached me in my rage, my mother and my ex-partner, had to be pummeled into begging me to understand their own pain. But those were not attempts to placate. They are both testimonials to a great love under duress. I won't recount Milton's treatment of his daughters. Several biographies, works of fiction, and even a play explore their relationship. But this revisioning of Milton is a late 20th century reckoning. Prior to the 20th century, Milton's daughters were held up as exemplars. There exist several paintings, all by male artists, that depict dutiful teenage women at the feet of handsome, stoic, middle-aged men, images of filial duty painted to instruct. I found one print that has stayed with me. It's different from the rest. Yes, one daughter is focused, transcribing her father's words. In every other way, though, the etching deviates from most portraits of Milton. The great poet sits in a shadow and looks haggard. He stares off at the wrong point, and his body is cocooned in a heavy, black cape. He appears vampiric. In the center of the etching, a second daughter is looking up, and she faces the viewer. One arm is thrust forward to protect herself. Her lips are slightly pursed, eyes askance. Sunlight from a nearby window crashes over her, turning her blonde hair into a halo. But it's the expression on her face that I try to understand. She doesn't appear unhappy, but she isn't doting either. She looks, in fact, defiant, as if considering recording the wrong words. It's as if the artist, and I've never been able to find a name, knows. To serve a blind man is not a privilege, but an ordeal of its own. It is a problematic portrait of disability, the praise of wholeness and youth over the selfishness of age and eventual degeneration, but I return to it again and again as a reminder, as the prescription. And I'm going to read one last short section. I'm a deep admirer of the artist William Kentridge. I don't know if anybody is familiar, but he does. He's somebody who's focused his whole life on drawing, and he's pushed the drawing. He doesn't do painting or photography or anything else. He just focuses on drawing, and he's pushed the drawing into extraordinary directions. He does these great animations, by the way, if you want to take a look at his work. And sometimes when I read this section, I actually also play one of his animations in the background. And he wrote this fantastic book called 6 Drawing Lessons. And I recommend it to you. It's also it's actually based on a lecture, and on YouTube there's a video of his lecture. I'm going to start sort of in the middle of the section. I'm reading a quote by Kentridge, and then I'm just sort of meditating on the quote, and this is where I start. When I read this, I think of Kentridge's charcoal self-portraits, drawn, erased, rebuilt. Kentridge informs us that he started drawing around 9, and that he started at the age drawing landscapes. Through the process of his art education, he realized the landscapes he built along a horizon, what you're taught when you learn 3-point perspective, was actually something else. Classical perspective was useless in capturing the truth of what Kentridge was sitting on. Instead, he needed to think of the city he loved vertically, and what he's sitting on is Johannesburg, South Africa, and I should have made that clear. When I read this, something clicks for me about Kentridge's process. Because Kentridge comes to prominence outside of South Africa fairly late in his life, when he was in his mid-40s, it's hard to find images of him when he wasn't middle-aged. His renderings of himself are brutal. These aren't the wizened and sliced self-portraits of Rembrandt posing in Masonic regalia. Kentridge's self-portraits are vulnerable. For example, the series of standing full nudes drawn from behind. This has to be almost unheard of in self-portraits, a portrait of the back. But there is Kentridge, naked, head to toe, overweight and flabby. He's presenting himself as a subject to the viewer's erotic gaze, but he doesn't even bother to fudge a little, place a shadow here or there that might define muscle. No dad bod for him. If you know something of the history of the objectification of the female and black body, then these self-portraits are, in their honesty and frank humor about aging men, strangely satisfying. Or there's the benefactor in his animation monument. The benefactor, gluttonous, overbearing, repulsive if you look closely, is Kentridge himself. These portrayals don't seem entirely fair. Kentridge, for one thing, comes from a prominent Jewish family. He is very privileged, but he's also in South African society an outsider. His mother and father were both defense lawyers and often defended black clients. His father represented the families of the protesters killed during the Sharpeville massacres. Kentridge mentions discovering in his father's studio the photographs of the brutalized bodies of black men and women, though he doesn't valorize his father or the work his father did. Of course, Kentridge isn't the first visual artist to visit history on his own body. Performance artists have been doing this for half a century now. The work of Marina Abramovich, Yoko Ono, Bob Flanagan, Chris Burden come to mind, and they all, to varying painful degrees, inflicted harm on themselves. Kentridge's drawings are sedate in comparison, and yet I still find Kentridge's willingness to mark and remark his own body in relation to South Africa's brutal history fascinating. Self-portraits are meant to demonstrate both skill and the ability to capture interiority. Kentridge's self-portraits, fleshy and brutish, are penance. They are vertical deconstructions of self as a price paid for history. I respect him for offering his own body. I wonder then what it means for me to think vertically about my own self. I realized my 20-year-old mistake. I thought I had to prove skill. And I'm sorry, I forgot to mention something else really important. I have a degree in drawing from the Art Institute of Chicago, so that's my Chicago connection. And I gave it up, though, in my early 20s because I didn't think I was very good. So anyway, I thought I had to prove skill. Now I realize that all I have to offer is my body as presence, as protest, as historical mistake, a cervix and womb that is now surely useless and collapsing, a body once imagined that came to take up space, and now in middle age is slowly relinquishing it, a body marked and scarred and erased and etched back, a threadbare body patched and repatched. I've never appreciated when my teachers made grandiose pronouncements about what is needed to make great art, so I'm not going to utter what seems to come next, that to be an artist I need to draw myself debased. But I do think that decades ago I gave up because I thought far too highly of myself. Now I see myself small in the vastness of whatever it is that unfolds before me, culture, history, time. I have never been very much at all, and now why not keep at what little I have? I'm going to stop there. Thank you. You've been a great audience. I know this is the middle of the semester and this is a lot, and there's a mayoral debate downstairs or something, so more entertaining.
We have time for questions.
I would love questions. I have a question for you. How many of you are creating writing majors or minors or associates? Oh, so good. All right, good. How many of you work in the form of the essay? There's going to be fewer hands. Oh, 2. Okay, 3, maybe. All right, okay. All right, good. Good. How many of you hate essays? Oh, good. I'm glad that you raised your hand. Okay, good. All right, good. Yeah. Oh, sorry, do you have a question? I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. I was going to ask if you mentioned that you switched from writing fiction to writing essays. What kind of fiction did you write?
That's a really fantastic question. I worked on the short story, and I have as I mentioned in the bio, I have a short story collection out. And I actually think fiction was a great... I'm not sure that I would be a very good essayist at all if I hadn't trained for a long time as a fiction writer. I think that fiction writing is a great practice in building things like tension and interest and story arc and all that, and really having to engage a reader. And I don't know if I will ever return to fiction. That's the kind of the strange thing. But I do love it. And I do love the short story. And by the way, I just something that isn't super well known about me, but I've been started creating comics, and I'm actually working on a graphic actually to work of graphic journalism, and so that might be another potential question somebody might want to ask me. So yeah, oh yeah, great, good.
I know this sounds a little bit cheesy, but was there any special emotions that you prominently felt when you were writing these essays?
Oh, that's not a cheesy question. That's a fantastic question. Thank you. That's a great question, because I think a lot of times we don't associate the essay with feeling, right? I'm sorry, I'm going to be a teacher for a moment. It's the history of the essay. No, everyone's going to get bored right there. But anyway, the history of the essay is in the sciences, right? It was used. I mean, Montaigne, Bacon, all these great essayists, they were scientists, really. They thought of themselves, because they were philosophers, they thought of themselves as in the science. And even though aesthetics mattered to them, that's the root. And so we don't associate essays, I think, with feeling. But if you go back and look, you do see Montaigne has a lot of feeling, right? I felt a range of essays, but I think grief, this is I know that maybe, I don't know. This is not maybe the best recommendation of the book. Oh, it's a book about sadness, but it is a book of me trying to work through grief to a certain extent. And especially my mother had passed away 10 years ago, actually, and she passed away February 2nd, 2013, so 10 years, just really quite recently. And I think it was a lot of me trying to deal with the grief of that. So in some ways, this might be a sort of a love letter to her. All the kinds of things I couldn't have told her when she was alive, which is, I know, a strange thing. But there's also, it's divided into 2 different sections, loss and then recovery. So I do want to say that I hope it ends in a kind of a happier place in which the grief is helping me to find a way to exist in this world. So that's a lovely question. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Do you have any advice for aspiring writers?
Oh gosh, I have lots of advice. I guess too. The problem with advice like this, though, is it tends to be so cliche. But I think one of the first things is to stick with it. I mean, it's neither here nor there. I've gone back to drawing, but I really made a terrible mistake when I told myself in my early 20s. I think this happens a lot to artists. I think you see it happen, you see artists say a lot. In the early 20s, I think it might be a kind of crisis moment for a lot of writers and painters and dancers, and, where they go, like, this is tough, and what am I going to do with this? And I mean this as somebody who teaches within institutions. A lot of what you're told by institutions makes it even harder to do it, to keep at it, right? About whether you're good or you're bad. And so I think find a way to filter that noise. You can't ignore it, but I think you need to find a way to use it and then keep at it. Just realize that this is a moment that everyone goes through as an artist, and then just keep going, right? And it may take you finding another form. That's what happened with me. I also don't know that it has to happen right away. Did I give up drawing? Yes. But did I come back to it? Yes. I'm drawing now. There's no clock on it. And the other thing that I think is really important is to create a community of people. To create a community of people that support you as a writer, as a human being. I have so many great friends. Stephanie and I have a friend in common, Matthew Neil Null, who's a fantastic writer and a very good person. I would say, look to the person next to you in the classroom, the person next to you working on the literary magazine with you, and forge those friendships, remember their names. You'll see them again. I'm very convinced I'm going to see Kiana's name again. Also, really be enthusiastic about supporting them in their work and create that community. It's what gets you through, because there's a lot of self-doubt in this. There's a lot of joy, but there's a lot of self-doubt. So, yeah, that's another great question. Thank you. Do you have time for one more question? Yeah, great. Good.
Sure, yeah. This is sort of, I guess, specific to sort of practicing writers, but when you finish a piece and then it's time to submit it or send it off to a contest or put it out in the world, and you run up against a word limit, like they say, this is great, but we're only taking things half this size, like especially with essays, how do you chop? And like, how do you just kill your darlings in a sense and just kind of decide, well, I'm gonna have to shrink you into something that you're not in order to like get you places, if that makes sense.
I would just do it, because there's sort of like the there's just the truth of publishing. It's rare in literary magazines for all sorts of reasons that anybody lets you go over the word limit. There's a reason they do that. And some of it has to do with wanting to be able to include many different pieces and voices. So what I do, though, is that I tell myself that it'll go one day into a book. And in the book, I can put that longer, expanded piece. I think it's just one of that's about the professionalism, and I think it's also just a fantastic question, because that's another thing that you come up against is, what does this mean to be a professional in this field? And I want to have an artistic vision and want to be able to express oneself, but then run up against things like, what does a literary magazine require? Or what does one of the things when I was actually sending out this collection, also my short story collection, is that I looked at the page, like the number of pages that most of these collections had, and realized that I had to cut manuscripts in half, basically, and really select. So we're always making those kinds of decisions. But also know that you'll find another place for it, and keep that in your heart, right? So that you can kind of go, okay, I'll let this sort of like, this version that I'm not so in love with, but is meeting the word limit out there. So yeah. Yeah, good. Oh, great. Yes.
How do you balance writing about things in your life that are painful, sort of back to this question about the emotion in the piece, as well as making sure that it's appropriate for an audience, as well as just grappling with writing about something painful.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess what I'm. So are you asking? I just want to make sure that I'm. Are you asking how do I know my audience can handle this?
Kind of, and also just are there any ways that you approach keeping your own? How do you approach writing about your own lives, truths and pains and hardships, alongside keeping yourself safe as a writer?
Oh, okay. That's great. Yeah, that's such a great question. So I saw this on Twitter of all places, but it was so true. It was a memoirist who's talking. His book just came out, and she said the tweet was, "Oh my God, if I knew that people were going to read this, I would never have published it." And I mean, she's doing quite well. And I think it was, but there is that there actually is that moment when you're doing CNF where you think, "Oh wow, I put that out there," and but there it exists. I think though that, and there's actually some really painful essays in this. There's actually an essay in here that is about why I left Chicago, and it's about a really it actually is a terrible incident. And I had spent from that time, I was in my very, very early 20s when I was in Chicago. From that time, I'd spent decades going over this. I don't know whether anybody's trying to deal with some sort of trauma, but you sort of, one of the things that happens is that you begin to kind of revisit it over and over and over again, right? And it becomes this really sort of cycle that you can't kind of, does anyone, I see people nodding, so you know what I'm talking about. This was decades of doing this. And then I wrote this essay. I didn't send it out to literary magazine or anything like that. I knew it was just going to go in this collection. And do you know that once I did that, I've stopped the cycling? And I'm not suggesting essayist therapists, because I wouldn't want to ever do that. But I do think that there's this narrativizing impulse in us that needs to put our pain and grief into kind of a story and give it some sort of meaning. And in doing that, and even if it's the right meaning or the wrong meaning, I don't know in the end, it's not really up to me. But I found that there was something really useful in sharing these experiences. I'm really humiliated by, I'm still humiliated by the I, not the pronoun, but the actual I. It was really, one of the things I didn't make clear is I wanted to write a kind of a funny essay, and there are funny moments in this about a trauma like that, and it was great to make fun of your own pain. And so I think overall my experience has been a very good one. I will say this for everybody who's writing CNF, but even fiction, you need to set your own rules, and one of maybe the practices of art is figuring out how to set your own rules for things. And I did set rules for myself in this. There's some things I don't reveal. I don't expose certain people. And I will say one thing, this is my piece of advice to everybody writing CNF, memoir, essay. Only write about another person and publish it if you're hoping to lose them, okay? Because they will be out there, all right? And you should at the very least let them see. And so maybe that's one of the ethical things. So maybe, to me, that was the bigger consideration is there are some people in here who are still alive. And who was I going to let them see them on the page? And who was I, who would I just sort of expose and then not, Sorry, that's a very long-winded answer. I'm sorry. But I think it is sort of the mission of CNF is that sort of personal aspect. And so kind of went in knowing I'd have to do that.
We have time for one more question.
Oh yeah, great! Oh yay! That's yay! That seems only right.
So, in the last piece you read, you mentioned something like how the artist would visit history on his own body and sort of use his body as his artwork. And in a lot of ways, I can see sort of essays being that for us, sort of extensions of our bodies. And sort of along with the previous question, do you think CNF can ever be, have you ever had experiences where CNF was a little unsafe for you, where maybe it was too close? And in those situations, do you think fiction would offer a little more distance and a little less gravity?
Yeah. Oh, that's a fantastic question. I actually had, I think, the reverse experience where I was doing fiction because I needed that distance, and it actually. I think, I'm sorry, in answering this, I'm realizing some things. And so this does go to the the previous question as well, I think some of it's also getting older and sort of realizing that how you're comfortable with your history and your pain and your sort of experience. And so I think the collection was a way, like I wrote about the Civil War in Sri Lanka. I did a lot of research on that, and I spent a lot of time in Sri Lanka, and I spent a lot of time talking to people. I didn't feel safe politically, like I still had family there. I still wanted to go back and forth. I didn't, because of the political situation, I wasn't sure that I could write from my first person experience as if and so I used fiction as the lens in which I could translate that. I think, and that's part of the reason for the title, Dark Tourist, actually. The process of growing as an artist has made me feel more sure of myself. And maybe I'll just leave you with this. I think one of the things that I've become more sure about is that there's this fantastic writer, may have visited recently, Anna Badkin. Is anybody familiar with Anna Badkin's work? Journalist, essayist, really brilliant. And 7 books out there. I really highly recommend her. But she started off as a journalist, and when she was training the journalist, her colleagues told her that she should write in order to make the rest of the world feel less afraid. And I loved that. And I think one of the things to think about, and I hear this a lot, but I think it's very good advice, is to write what you're afraid of. Write towards what you're afraid of. And I'm trying to do that all the time. And I think that each of the books I'm working on puts me in more and more sorts of precarious spaces, but I feel more sure of it because of the richness of the tools that I get from creative writing and from art. So yeah, thank you everybody. Thank you.